There was a kid at my school named Blake, and he was the kind of guy who drew a lot of attention, but for all the wrong reasons. He faced a lot of bullying, both behind his back and right to his face. But honestly, a lot of people thought he deserved it. Blake was prone to violent outbursts and regularly got in trouble for screaming at teachers, usually because he was spouting off about some extreme ideas that clashed with what was being taught. It's hard to say how much of it was his fault versus how he was raised, but that didn't stop anyone from making him a target. Blake wasn't just difficult to deal with, he was also kind of repulsive. There was an incident where he almost got expelled for harassing a girl after she rejected him, reportedly because he smelled like garbage. If he'd been kicked out then, things might have ended differently. One day, during history class, Blake interrupted to argue with the teacher about something related to the Civil War. It quickly escalated into a huge scene. The teacher wasn't having it and shut Blake down with cold, hard facts, humiliating him in front of everyone. Blake responded by shouting about how the country was ruined, but we all just laughed him off. He stormed out of the school, and that was that. It was a Friday. Over the weekend, Blake posted a series of disturbing images on Snapchat. There were pictures of him holding pieces from his dad's gun collection, which he had bragged about before, and another photo of him posing in front of a Nazi flag, also his dad's, I assume. But the most chilling image was of our history teacher's photo taped to a cardboard box that he used for target practice with the caption, "Getting ready for school on Monday." The posts sent a shiver down my spine. People had joked for years that Blake might do something like this, but no one thought he'd actually go through with it. Several people reported the posts to the school, but in hindsight, they should have gone straight to the police. I didn't take it seriously enough either. If I had, there's no way I would have gone to school that Monday. That day, Blake didn't show up until 5th period, which was when we had American history class. But he didn't make it into the classroom. From what I heard later, he was confronted by the school resource officer and a couple of administrators who wanted to search his backpack. That's when he pulled out a pistol and shot the resource officer before running off. I heard the shot from the other side of the school, and everything went silent. Moments later, the lockdown order came over the intercom. We all knew it was Blake. I glanced at my teacher, who looked as pale as a ghost. All I could think about was the bullet holes in that photo of him from Blake's Snapchat post. After a few seconds, the teacher snapped out of it and went through the lockdown procedure, locking the door, turning off the lights, and telling us to hide out of sight. We barely had time to react before Blake reached our classroom door. He started banging on it, yelling, "I know you're in there! I'm not an idiot!" People around me were crying into their shirts to muffle the sound, while others took out their phones to live stream or text their loved ones, fearing they wouldn't make it out alive. Even I started to think like that. I couldn't come up with any plan to protect myself if Blake got inside. My mind was too clouded with fear, and the whole situation felt surreal. All I could think was that I was about to die, cowering on the tile floor of my high school. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and the crying turned into full-blown screaming. The classroom erupted into chaos. In a moment of panic, I ran to the window, thinking it was better to jump from the second story than wait for Blake to break in and shoot me. A bunch of other kids followed, but in the chaos, I got shoved to the ground. That's when I noticed something. Blake was holding his face with both hands, blood seeping through his fingers. The door handle was lopsided, like he'd tried to shoot it open but had somehow failed. I just sat there, staring, trying to make sense of it. My teacher was yelling at us to get away from the windows and back into hiding, but I was frozen. All I could manage to say was, "I think Blake shot himself." I said it quietly, but enough people heard me to stop what they were doing and go silent. A friend of mine ran to the door and looked out the small window. He saw Blake stumbling away down the hallway. I finally stood up and joined him, seeing the blood splattered across the floor. In the newfound quiet, I could hear Blake's cries of pain echoing down the hall. Against every bit of sense I had, I tried to open the door, but it was broken. Blake's shot had mangled the lock shut. We were trapped inside, but at least Blake was gone. Hours later, we were finally freed and learned what had happened. Blake had tried to shoot the door handle to get in, but instead, he destroyed the lock and sent metal shrapnel flying into his face. A piece of twisted metal lodged in his eye, blinding him, and that ended his rampage. It was a lucky break for all of us, and it disproved the myth that you can just shoot a lock open. Blake surrendered after leaving the school and was tried as an adult. He'll be in prison for at least the next 20 years. The resource officer he shot also got lucky and recovered without any serious lasting effects on his health. I recently started my first real job as a teacher at a public elementary school in a nearby neighborhood. It was my first year teaching, and at the time, it was only September, so I was still getting the hang of things. Honestly, it was pretty stressful. I was teaching a first grade class with around 20 kids, so you can imagine how chaotic it could get, especially with my lack of experience. One day, while I was in the middle of assigning the kids a worksheet for spelling simple words, the principal's voice suddenly came over the school's loudspeaker, ordering a lockdown. Since I was new, I hadn't been informed about when the school would conduct lockdown drills, so I had no idea if this was just a drill or something more serious. Either way, I knew I had to follow the procedure. I quickly turned off the lights, locked the doors and windows, and had the kids sit against the walls out of sight. We sat in complete silence for about 5 minutes when I started hearing faint banging noises on doors down the hall. My heart began to race as the sounds grew louder, indicating whoever was banging on the doors was getting closer. At that point, I still didn't know if it was just the principal checking the classroom locks or if there was an actual intruder in the school. But then, one of my students suddenly burst into tears, and it was loud. There was no doubt that whoever was outside could hear it. The banging stopped in response to the noise, and I then heard a single pair of footsteps walking up to our door. For a few seconds, there was silence, but it was quickly broken by a male voice shouting, "Hey, guys, I think there are kids in this one." That was the moment I realized this lockdown was real. More footsteps could be heard running up to the door, followed by what sounded like genuine attempts to break it down. By this point, every single kid in the class was either crying or screaming in fear. I was at a loss for what to do. I had never been trained for a situation like this. Then, suddenly, 2 gunshots echoed through the building. But they didn't come from the intruders. The police had arrived and were now inside the school. After the shots were fired, I heard the intruders running down the hall. 30 minutes later, we were given the all clear. It turns out the intruders were 3 local high school students. They were eventually caught, but when asked why they did it, they barely said anything. One of them claimed it was all a dare, but personally, I don't buy that for a second. No dare is worth risking going to court over or potentially losing your freedom. I firmly believe they had much darker intentions. Thankfully, although most of us were traumatized, no one was physically hurt. The shots fired by the police were later confirmed to be warning shots, aimed directly at the ground. It's been 2 years since this incident, and I still teach first grade at the same school, even in the same classroom. To this day, the bullet holes from that day can still be seen in the school's hallway. Back in my junior year of high school, we went on a 2-day field trip for one of my classes. We visited an amusement park as part of our science class, which was a lot of fun. However, I missed a test in another class, but luckily, my teacher was understanding and allowed me to make it up the following day after school. The test was for Spanish, and the classroom was located at the far end of a hallway on the north side of the building. After school, I headed to the Spanish classroom. When I arrived, Mr. Jordan, my teacher, was there along with a few other students. I'm not entirely sure what the other students were doing, probably making up an assignment or something. Mr. Jordan handed me the test and suggested I take it in a different room so I wouldn't be distracted by the students who were going to be talking with him. He had a key to a nearby Spanish classroom belonging to Mrs. Aceves, who had already left for the day, and said I could take the test there. We walked over to Mrs. Aceves' classroom, and Mr. Jordan wished me good luck before heading back to his room. I sat down at a random desk and started the exam. Spanish was a subject I was decent at, but I wasn't expecting to ace the test. Still, as I progressed through it, I felt pretty confident about my answers. Then, just as I was nearing the end of the test, I suddenly heard an announcement. The school was going into lockdown. This was strange, considering it was after school hours. I didn't even know schools could have lockdowns when classes weren't in session, but I guess it made sense. I wasn't sure what to do next. I could either stay put in Mrs. Aceves' classroom or try to make my way back to Mr. Jordan's room, which was just around the corner. After a brief moment of indecision, I decided to head back to Mr. Jordan's room. The distance was short. His room was only about 50 feet away, separated by just one other classroom. I left the classroom and walked quickly down the hallway toward Mr. Jordan's room. When I got there, I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I expected Mr. Jordan to come and open it any second, but right then, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw a woman coming from around the corner near Mrs. Aceves' room. She wasn't a student or a teacher, and her hair was disheveled. Immediately, I had a gut feeling that she was the reason for the lockdown. The woman started walking towards me, and without waiting any longer for Mr. Jordan, I turned and began walking away, further down the hallway. As I walked faster, I could hear her following me. The empty, silent hallway only added to the creepiness of the situation. I started picking up the pace, but so did she. I took a turn into another hallway, hoping to lose her, but she continued to follow. My heart was racing, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if she caught up with me. I kept moving, taking one hallway after another, but she was always right behind me. Eventually, I made it all the way to the front of the school. I saw the main entrance and bolted for it. As soon as I got outside, I noticed that the woman didn't follow me. She stayed inside the building. I didn't waste any time and ran straight to my car before driving home. Later, I learned that the woman was indeed the reason for the lockdown. I'm not sure what exactly she did, but the police were called and they showed up at the entrance where she had been seen, which wasn't the main entrance I had used to leave. Apparently, Mr. Jordan had been on his way to unlock the door for me when I decided to walk away. The next day after school, Mr. Jordan let me finish the test, and I was just relieved that the woman never caught up with me.